Okay. So hopefully it'll record. I've closed down all my files. What I want to cover today is building functions, right? And I'll talk about that a little bit as we go on. I'm going to create a new Python file, which I'll just, first one I'm going to call is just function stuff. So kind of with my other names. We will, after we talk about functions in general, we'll make a program using them so you can sort of see how they flow. So we've used one function. Do you guys know what function have we used? Main, yeah. So main is usually the starting point. It's a little vaguer in Python because you can start with anything and do anything you want pretty much. But in other languages, the main is always the starting point. So in Python, there's sort of just a stylistic thing to start with main also, right? But you don't have to stick to main. And in fact, if you're doing a complex program, it's a better idea to break things into separate functions. And ideally, let's just do, ideally you should break it into separate functions. And ideally, each function should do one thing. I'm putting this there so it'll be in the blog when I post it. Now, that one thing could be complicated. That doesn't mean you only have one line of code or something, although some of our functions will. When you have a really complicated piece of code, breaking it into functions makes it easier to troubleshoot, because if you know if something goes wrong, it had to go wrong in that function, right? The function that's doing that one thing. When we do this here, actually it's going to make our programs more complicated and difficult for a while because what we're doing is so simple. But I want you to get the feeling of doing the functions. Does that make sense? I'm going to do, as I said, a really stupid simple function just to give you an idea. Functions always start with def, short for define. And so what we want to do is we want to define the function name. Method is just another word for function if you're looking at that. We're not going to build a class right now. We're just going to build a function. So I'm going to just say, this is a really stupid function, but I'm going to say hello. It will be the name of our function. It'll have empty parentheses. And I'm just going to, it'll have a colon. And I will just print hello, all you Martians or whatever. All right. So this is just a simple function. It has nothing going on. We're going to look at some variations of this of the function. So that just prints a line. That's all that function does. In order to run that, you have to call it. Remember how you call main? We could call hello right here, or a better structure is to do a def main, and in def main to call hello. And maybe I should not capitalize the hello, but we did. To call a function, all you have to do is name it with whatever arguments, which in our case is 0, right? With 2 empty parentheses. And then we could call main. Now you don't have to do this. You could just, instead of main here, you could just put hello. But as I said, it's usually considered good form to start with. So we created a little function. We're calling it in main, and then we're calling main. One of the things that main should be, once we get going, main should do nothing except call the function that starts the program. Right? In a lot of forms things, what main does is it just calls first form. Right? So I'm going to do, I'll run this. And it takes a while, so it prints the line, hello all you Martians. that make sense? What questions do you have on just those as functions? Again, we could have done this in one line in main, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the hello call, does that has to be in?
Yes, because it's inside the main. Now, if I did, I could just do hello here instead of main, right? And it would call it just the same as it is now. You would just put it main hello up against the. So if I didn't want, so I'll comment this for a moment. As I said, it's mostly that main is treated as the logical starting point for a program. This has exactly the same effect. Right? That has exactly the same effect. I think it's a little bit less good as a structure because of the expectations of people. That main is the starting point. Does that make sense? But that works just fine. The other thing is, if you ever move off to another language, this won't work at all. There you'd have to call it in. So this is exactly the same as doing these. I told you what we're doing is going to make things more complicated for a while. I'm going to uncomment those and this. And then get rid of that. If I left it there, it wouldn't throw an error. It would just say hello Martians twice. Does that make sense? As I said, we're going to look at more complicated ones in a moment, but I just want to get the idea of functions done. So that's a function, just def hello. Just as a side, it's not really relevant to Python, but a lot of other languages won't let you just write functions like this. You have to put them inside of another structure called a class, which we'll look at later. Functions started, anybody, probably nobody, but does anybody ever do like GW Basic or any of those early forms of Basic?
Visual Basic?
Before Visual Basic.
I did Visual Basic.
Yeah. So before Visual Basic, there was just GW Basic, which is what came with DOS on your disk. And the thing about it, and this is also true of programs like early forms of COBOL and things like that, is they just started at the top and just wrote down. You just kept adding lines. In GW Basic, you had a limit of 32,000 lines, just because they numbered them and they went for 1 byte. 2 bytes? Might be 2 bytes. Anyway, it goes down, and you had 32,000 lines that you could do. And there was no break, right? So if you wanted to reuse code, you had to do a go-to. If you've heard of go-tos, they're one of the horrible do not do's in programming now, because you'd go down and then you'd say go back up to line 42, do something, and then you'd have to say go down to line, you just have to leap around. It made debugging impossible. And the more complex programs got, the more harder it was to debug, the harder it was to use code. So there was a thing that arose called structural programming. And the idea of structural programming was to break things into functions so that each function did one thing, and that way you could reuse it by recalling the function. You didn't have to use a go-to. And you could troubleshoot it easier, because if each function does one thing, if that one thing goes wrong, you know where to look. So it makes a better structure. It's still not sufficient, which is where we go after we do functions for a while. We'll go to classes. Classes bundle functions together in ways that make sense in an even more complicated environment. So anyway, functional programming. Yeah.
Do you need both defines to make it work?
Well, it'll work without this.
That's what it's gonna run.
But I'm saying it's not good form. And in other languages, it would not work. All right. So what you want to break things up. And main, the function of main is to start the program. That's the idea. We're going to make programs with lots of defs. I'm going to change a couple of things. We're going to do a couple of different versions of this. Here's the question. Do you need the other versions saved? Do you need all the versions saved? Because if I mess this up, in the end, we'll only end up with the final version. This is for you guys. Do you want me to post all versions or just the final version that we get to? All right. So the way that I will do that, I'm going to comment it out. There should be, and I haven't explored, to find out, but is there a way to highlight everything and comment it?
Yeah, control forward slash. Yeah.
Forward slash?
Control plus forward slash.
Oh, okay. So if I went like this and then control forward slash, I took it away and it adds it. Okay. Thank you. I'm not real good at sometimes exploring all of the.
It's like a Visual Studio kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, Visual Studio also, and I tend to be a little too mouse centric, had an icon at the top that you could click and highlight, you know. Well, it's not hard. You just have to remember all the keystrokes. And over the years, I've gotten lazy with keystrokes. All right, so I'm going to do a slightly different one of these. Again, we're going to do some really dumb ones, and then we'll try to do one that's a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to do def. What is that? I'm going to call it get name. And I'm going to do name equals input, basically enter your name. Okay. And we're going to do a little bit more with this, but I'm going to go on to the next one. And then I'm going to do def, and I'll call this one hello2. And I'm going to put name here. And I'm going to just print hello and then name. And what I'm going to do up here, the last line I'm going to do here is I'm going to call hello2, and I'm going to put name there. And then I'll do def main. So I'm going to do def main, and then we'll talk about this. And in main, I'll just call, I guess, get name. And then I'll call main. Okay, so now we have 4 methods. See if I can get it all in there. So actually we've got 3 methods. We've got one that will allow us to enter the name. We've got one that will print the hello plus the name, and then we've got main, which we'll call this one. And then down below that, there's main, where we call main, right? Does anybody know what's happening here? Total blank. All right. Yeah.
It's like calling each. I don't know. It's called function.
Yeah, they usually call them functions in Python. Methods is what they often call them in other languages. Yeah. So hello 2 is this, right? And it takes an argument, what they call a parameter. It takes a parameter called name. So what we're doing here is we're getting that name and we're passing it down here. They do not have to have the same name. I mean, the function, the parameter, up here I could say, I could call this, I don't know, what do you want to call it besides name? Joe. And I could pass Joe and it would map to name down here. Right? It's not mapped by name, it's just mapped by position. First parameter match to first. But you can't call this function without passing it a string. It has to be a string. Does that make sense? And then what it'll do is it'll print it out. Actually, in Python, it could be whatever because it doesn't know what the data type is. So here we're going to get the input, then we call the second function, we pass a parameter to that function, and then it will use that parameter to print out this. Then we'll call the name, which calls this one, which calls this one, right? And then it'll do. We could draw some diagrams if you want for this. So one of the things that this is doing, each one does one thing. This gets the name, right? Then it calls the one that's going to print the name. So this function does nothing but print the name. Main calls this one because that's the only one we have to call because this one will get the name and call the second one. And then down below is main, which calls this. Does that make sense? One of the things that can get a little tricky with these is what calls what and where. And it's, but this will work. So I'm going to, I'll run this. So it says enter your name, and I didn't leave myself any room, so it's going to be right in there. So I'll do Steve, and it'll say hello, Steve, right? We've done this from like day one. This is a really stupid functions, but they are showing you how the functions work. So here we got the name Steve. This is Steve is what's being stored in this variable. That gets sent down here. It prints that, right? So get name calls this, which calls this. That's all called by name. So how confused did I make you at this point? It's okay? No?
No.
Yeah. Confusion back anywhere? It's okay if you are. I just want your questions so you don't get more confused because I'm going to probably make it worse later.
So could you do the same for like essentially anything, like for calculating the tip? You could do like get amount and amount input.
Right.
Amount.
I'm going to show you a couple of ways to do that, actually. This is one way. Yes, you could just pass it through the values, right? And you can do combinations of things of what I'm going to show you. So I'm going to show you another way to do this. And let's do, so we got hello name. Let's get, add one function in here. So we've got print name. This is going to be done a different way. And it doesn't, I'm going to say get age. And I'll say, let's just do age equals, do we want to treat it as a string or do we want to, I think it'll treat it as a number, whatever we do. So let's do int. Enter your age. Not sure I really want to enter my age, but we'll see. All right. And I'm going to do a little bit different here. I'm going to add a word you may not have seen or you may have. I'm going to say return age. Okay. And then I'm going to modify this a little bit. And I'm going to say, I want to say something other than age. A equals, and I'm going to call get age. And then I'm going to say A, and then I'll just do O. I'll put years. Okay. This is another way to pass values. Now I could have, you could do like name, comma, age here. That's another thing you could do. But this, you can also return a value. And sometimes this works well, especially when you're doing calculations. You can return the value. So we're getting the age and we're returning it. When I return it, when I call it, notice I have something equal to this. It will assign whatever value is in the return to this variable. And then I can use it here. We'll do this a couple of times. Let's run it and then we'll talk through it again. It'll still work with main, right? Because main is calling get name, which calls, let's go up there, which calls hello2. Hello2 calls get age. One of the things that's going to be tricky in this when you're doing that is you don't want to call the same method twice unless you need it twice. You know what I mean? If you accidentally call it twice, you'll get repetitions of things. So I'm going to run this, and then we'll talk through it too. So I'm going to enter my name. I'll do my actual name again. Invalid. Like, why is it invalid? Oh, no input. Thank you. Good eye. I get talking, and I don't see what I type. All right, so I'm going to try this again. All right, so, and then this is hard to admit, but 63. Okay, so for what it's worth, I probably feel the reverse of that. And mentally, maybe more like 3, I don't know. So, again, what it did, so the first thing, the first function here takes an input for the name and then calls the function down here, which is the hello, and it passes it the variable that it got, their name. That one calls get age. So this one calls get age and gets the value from the return. And then it prints out this, right? It prints out the name, which we get from the first one, and the age, which we get from the second one. Yeah.
Is the return function in this one too?
You could have done a return there too. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, but what's the primarily use for it?
Well, so return, it's really, when you're working with your functions, you have to kind of just, there's not an absolute rule of which one you should do. You can either pass on the variable or you can return it. So if I just returned name, down here where I do a print, I would say like n equals get name. A equals get age.
You wouldn't have to put name next to the function?
No, in fact you wouldn't want to. This is if you're passing a parameter, and this is if you return it. If you return it, you call the function inside the other function. If you're passing it, then you just call it inside this function, the same function, and pass the value through. Either way will work, and it just sort of depends on what you're doing, which works best. Now, if you have to get like a calculation and you need a lot of different values, the return works better because you can call multiple functions that way. that make sense? Let's do one that kind of does.
So that they can't talk to each other on each function once they're called.
They cannot, that's right. They do not talk to each other at all unless they're called. Yes. If a function isn't called, it does nothing, no matter what code you put in. So again, this calls getAge, and the main calls getName. This calls hello2, right? They have to be called, and it can be a little tricky with what calls what. I mean, it takes a while to get used to. This is a kind of a big leap up in terms of complexity, but it gives you a lot more power. I don't expect it to sink in instantly. Yeah. Did you have a question?
I can ask another one.
That's okay.
Not quite what I want to.
Well, which one?
The first part did work, but the second didn't. I like double checking.
You had what?
Double checks.
Oh, put parentheses after name. Yeah, it should work. Yeah, mine's so different.
Yeah, you should.
Let's look and see. So you have hello. I think it might be because you're getting this one as well. You might want to, would you have two def names? I don't think you can both. So you might want to comment on these. Well, I mean, comment. Not actually present. Well, you still have def names twice. I would comment this out. I think it's running the first one, not running the second. Put a hash. Well, no, comment. Yeah. And actually, that's. Yeah, comment the hello to. Did you have a hello to? Forget that I think you were. So try it out. Hello there. Actually, what you want to call it here is
He's in calling. Is it? Oh, I think it might be that you weren't calling.
So we got name.
I'm not sure
Oh,
though.
you didn't call.
If it's.
You need to call hello to there.
Well,
No, don't uncomment.
it's yeah.
This one.
Because you're not calling
Because
it
you have
hello
hello
to
to
it.
there.
Maybe.
So
It doesn't look
like
like he's.
press enter.
He may be calling it in the
Undo
first
hello
name.
to.
So below hello, you'd
And
call
then in
hello
parentheses
to,
put name.
and maybe see if that
I'll
works.
put a parentheses. Please. Say
Right,
that for me.
hello here, or you call it, yeah.
Now it shows. And now you're calling the other function.
No, you just call hello to. So just hello to and then the two groups names. And then
Name hello to is not assigned. Oh, you have an extra E.
oh, it's lowercase h.
Okay, so You left out a T, I think.
It always happens.
Yeah. But I think it'll work once you get the typos out. Yeah. Then we're gonna do some more stuff and then I'll look at you guys. All right, so you got we need the
That's because I don't know why it's in the
we
name.
need the hello. We got the hello too, but we need the input. We need
Are you not? I think you might need to.
See at the top. What you're missing is you're missing this. All right, one more look here, and then we'll do the next thing. You know what? I think you should suggest maybe, yeah, because all of from here have because it's really good. No, you can't have two functions at the same time. How still doesn't the same.
Yes, you aren't on hello two. It looks like.
Oh, we just get name, you need to call hello. Hello to. And then inside the yeah, I do that. Okay. All right, so it could take, this is a little bit more complicated, as I said, just moving things, through the different functions. And again, whether you pass the value or return the value is sort of just depends on the logic of what you're doing. Let's do an actual, I'll make a new file for this one. Let's do it like an actual program. Very simple still, but a little bit more, yeah.
So if we don't call several diff, we can still make it, right?
If you what?
If we don't call several, definition, we can still make it. That's the old time. Def main and.
Oh, you could do all of this in main if you were, but again, it's not good form, especially as it gets more complicated. When you have a really complex program, it actually makes a lot of sense to break it into functions. These are so simple, it actually doesn't make sense to break it into functions because we're making our life harder. But it. So, yeah, you have to have quotes in there. Enter your name has to be in quotes. All right, I'm going to do another file. I'll put all of these onto the blog. Let's do a simple calculation like gas mileage. Do you guys drive? So I'm going to add a new file. I'll call it gas mileage pi. I'm going to start with some comments. If you think about a gas mileage, what do you need to do this calculation? What kind of input do you need? I don't know if you need the speed. You do need the miles, and you need the gallons, right? Now, speed would be a really much harder thing to calculate to determine. Yeah. That's actually all you need is inputs or miles and gallons, unless you want to do other things like calculate the price per gallon and the price per mile or anything. But we'll just keep it simple. And then the steps that we need. Whoa, I don't know what I just did, but all right, go back to gas mileage. Yes. So one of the things the steps that we're going to do is we need to get our inputs, right? And then we need to calculate the mileage. And then we need to do our output. And I'm doing this because actually when you start writing more complicated programs, it really is worth taking a minute or days, depending on how complicated, figuring out the flow. What is it that you're trying to do? What are the steps that you're trying to do? Because it's one thing, you don't want to have to fight with the syntax at the same time you're fighting with the logic. Right, so get the logic down. What is it that you need to do? We need to get the input for miles and gallons, and we need to do a calculation to get the mileage, and then we need to show the output. Does that make sense? So one of the rules is basically you should have each function should do one thing. Right, that's a basic idea of functions. So I'm going to just say def, and we'll call it get miles. And we could pass these, but I think I'm going to use returns for these. All right, and when you do a function, it's always def or define a name and parentheses, which can take arguments or not. We'll play with the arguments more after a bit too. But we're going to do like get miles. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to say miles equals, do we want it as an integer? You usually don't do half miles on these. What? You could do float if you want. I usually, you might enter depending on your odometer. Mine just does hold the miles, so I think you can see sometimes when it's not. I'm going to do int. And then this time I'll remember to do input. And I will say enter the total miles. I'm not doing, I'm assuming how many miles traveled. If you wanted to make this more sophisticated, you could have the original odometer reading and then the current odometer reading and then do a subtraction to get the number of miles. I'm just going to assume you do that on your own. We can expand this as much as you want. I'm going to do return miles. Okay. So we're just going to get the miles as an input, and then we're going to return that to wherever this. What return does is it gives that value to wherever function calls this. Right? Whenever you call this, you can get this return value. Does that make sense? We're going to do the same thing for gallons. It's going to be pretty much exactly the same. It's important that your functions go to the edge. So I'm going to say get gallons, colon, and then gallons equals int, and you could do float, you know, oh, input and lowercase I. All right, so enter the total gallons. And then we will return the gallons. That makes sense so far? We're making a function for each of the different things. You could theoretically make a function that just takes in both values, but you can only return one thing. There are ways to bundle them into a list or something, but in general, you can only return one thing. I think Python has some weird rules for that, but most languages you can only return one thing.
One thing per function.
Yeah.
What does it
But
mean?
that thing could be complicated. That thing could be a list of values. It could be an array.
So what does it mean to return?
It means that when you're doing this calculation, I'm going to show you in a moment. We will get that input. It's going to pass that on. When I call this function, I can have access to this value. Does that make sense? I'll show you. Because the next thing we're going to do is calculate, right? So I'm going to do def calculate mileage. And again, you can name these whatever you want. But I'm going to get the miles, so I'm going to say, I'm going to just do m equals get miles. I'm doing m, you could say miles here too. Just know that if you do, it's not the same variable as that. So I'm getting the miles. I'm going to get the gallons. And I'm going to do the calculation. So I'm going to say miles per gallon equals, oh, I did. This should be G. Thank you. M divided by G. Miles divided by gallons. And again, it would actually be better to use fuller names here. I just wanted to show you that these are technically different variables. But when I call get miles, it will give me the miles that I entered. When I call get gallons, it'll give me the gallons that I entered. And I can use those numbers here. But when it says it returns, that means that I can call this and assign this value to something in here. I can call this and assign it right to a variable. And you know, you might want M and G are kind of minimal. I might give them bigger names.
So in order to do that, you're saying you have to return in each one.
Yes, if you don't have a return here, you can't do this. But you could have passed. Now, the problem here is you can't call two different functions here. I mean, basically, in order to get these, I couldn't pass something from here and then pass something different from here. Does that make sense? So return is really the one way to do this here. But I'm going to show, we've done our calculation. Yeah.
It's one parameter per just the function. Yeah.
No, actually, you can pass many things. I'm going to do that on the next one. So we've done got our values. We need to do our output. So I'm going to do def, for lack of something else, I'll call it output. And what I'll do here is I'm going to pass, so we'll pass it miles, gallons, and miles per gallon. I just want to show you can pass multiple things. So when up here, I need to call output, and I need to pass it M, G, and MPG. Partially, I'm naming these differently so you can see. There's no magic here. First goes to first, second goes to second, third goes to third. If you screwed up the order, your math will just turn out.
Why in the output did you spell out miles per gallon?
Just
instead of
because I wanted to.
It wouldn't affect it, even though
It
you
doesn't
named
affect it. It doesn't know what these are. It passes first to first, second to second, third to third. If I were to screw these up, if I were to flip these, it wouldn't know the difference.
I just meant you named it MPG instead of miles per gallon.
Right, these names don't have to match.
Okay.
They're agnostic of each other. We're passing three values, whatever you name them. And they will get mapped to these three values by just sequence. That's the only thing it knows. First to first, second to second, third to third.
This function or from the one above it?
Well, it's from the
Oh,
call.
I see, yeah.
So we're calling output. So miles, gallons, yeah. Yeah.
Earlier, you said you were gonna call it something different, but instead of output, could you put return? Or
So if I returned here, I could only return like miles per gallon.
only one thing?
Yeah, one thing.
Okay, that's what it is.
Right, so this time what I'm gonna do is in the output, I'm gonna say you had X miles, X gallons, and 3 miles per gallon is this, right? So if I do a print here, I'm just going to do print let's just say, you drove, comma, M, comma, miles. I'm just going to do another print. You put in, and I'm going to do a comma, G, comma, gallons. Okay. You had so here it's miles per gallon. Actually, this can't be M. That has to be miles. It has to be what the parameters are. So that has to be gallons again. And then this would be, I want that comma outside the quotes.
Do you need a comma before miles?
Yes. Good eye. You had miles per gallon. I'm going to just put MPG here. All right. Does that make sense? So we're just using those variables in there. And that should be print, not pring, whatever pring is. Okay. So what we've got so far is we got the input for miles. We got the input for gallons. So we got calculate mileage, which calls the miles, calls the gallons using their return. We do our calculation, get a result that we're putting in MPG, and then this method, calculate mileage, calls the output. And it passes those three things here. And I deliberately named them differently so that you can tell that they're different. They hold the same number, but the variables themselves are different. It actually copies this to this, this to this, this to this. So they get recopied.
Is it just because they're in that order?
That's all that matters is the order.
So you could just say like random names.
You could. This could be X, Y, Z. It would be fine. It just passes it in sequence, in order. First to first, second to second, third to third. There's no magic. It doesn't understand the names. Does that make sense? You do have to use the names that are in the parameter list down here. because those are the local variables. Now, we need a def main to call it all. And which one would we call? Right? Actually, so the get miles gets called and calculate mileage, right? This is why, I mean, what you say makes sense, but because of calculate mileage calls get miles, it calls get gallons, and it calls output. This is sort of the center of it all, right? Yeah.
Alright, so, for each of the 3 lines under print, the
Yeah.
miles, gallons, and miles per gallon, is miles times if you scroll up, the original miles and you're calling it out or defining it, gallons is from that, or is it like right above?
So it's getting the values from here, but those values originally came from get miles and get gallons.
Right, so the one I'm confused about is the miles per gallon, where did it go?
MPG.
Okay. 'Cause the other
It's
one-
a calculation.
So that's, okay. I only asked because the other 2, the miles and gallons, were clearly under defined.
Right. I mean, and these could be different names. Right. But you're right. The same value is getting passed through.
Right,
So the get miles, that gets mapped to M.
right.
The get gallons gets mapped to G for gallons. Miles divided by gallons creates the miles per gallon. Then in output, we're passing miles, gallons, which these go back to the original ones. And then miles per gallon, which was calculated here. And then we're just printing it all out. And for main, what I would do, I would just call calculate mileage because it calls all the other methods. This is the tricky part, right? Because you kind of want to instinctively go through and call them in order. But if you do that, it'll do everything twice. Because when you get to calculate mileage, it calls them all again. Does that make sense? Calculate mileage calls get miles. It calls get gallons. It does the calculation and then it calls output. So calculate mileage is what you want to call in main because it calls everything else. And then what I'm going to do is we'll just call main. All right. So we could draw some pictures of this if you want. I'm going to run it here in a second, but let's walk through. So we're trying to break everything up into the pieces. Everything does one thing, and we basically got a function for every piece that has to be done. We need to get the input miles as part of that input. We need to get the gallons, right? So we need to pass on the miles and the gallons. Then we calculate the mileage, right? Which calls to get miles. So because we need the miles in order to do the calculation. It calls to get gallons because again we need those to do the calculation. We do the calculation, which is pretty minor here really. And then we have the output where we pass those 3 values through for the output. And you can pass as many parameters as you want. I think there's a limit of 255, but only in its same person. Because they're basically treated as an array, and it's a 1-byte array. All right. So we print all those things. Let's see if it works. I'm going to move this up a little, and I'm going to do. I'm going to do a quick exit. It doesn't. An interactive mode, which I don't want. I'm going to do clear. Okay. So down here it says, wow, is it running? Why is it running this other one? That's not in the same.
calculate mileage only.
Yeah, no, down here it says enter total miles, which is fine. I'm just wondering why it did the enter your name and stuff. I guess I didn't clear that. Anyway, so enter total miles. What do you want for total miles? Like 300? The gallons, let's say 21. So it's 14 point whatever miles per gallon. So so this is the input, miles and gallons. Down here, it gets passed down here that it was 300 miles, so the 321. And then the calculation is 14.285 whatever miles per gallon. These are the outputs, and it shows the calculation. That makes sense? Questions? Should we want to walk through that again? Yeah. Good stuff there. You think miles. Keep that in mind. Yeah, so what is it? Does it have an error? Input line. We done close the code. On miles, you get to close the code. Oh. That might be, yeah. Okay. All right, so where do you have P? Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that should be.
Yeah.
Just saying I was doing
Yeah, okay. It's all right. So we've got balance impact, automotive, return miles is spelled wrong. Return. Um, I'll go through another. Right there. And definitely. And those definitely. Yours working or no?
No. So it has something to get miles, get gallons.
Big gallons.
See, I always want to capitalize.
Yeah,
All right.
that might be all. Let's see. Looks like it's gonna go.
All right.
Just as a side, and this is fairly universal, and I do it too, 90% of your errors are gonna be capitalization. It says, we can't have space in there. guys okay? Trying to think if there's anything else I want to cover here. This is as I said, this is a complicated sort of thing, but it can give you a lot more power, especially as your programs grow more complex. How much time? We still got an hour. Do you need more examples, or how do you guys feel about this? What? You want another one? Okay, we could do another one. Couple of things. Again, just for the logic of this, I mean, I'll do another file and I'll post all of these. So I returned these values because you can only return one thing, right? That's one reason I separated these out. Down here where I passed everything, I really couldn't have got these from the return. If I called get miles again and get gallons, it would have asked me for those, the input the new miles and the new gallons, right? It would have asked me for those again. So I can't just get them there. This is pretty much the only way if I wanted all three values that I could pass them through. I'd have to pass them through. The return here wouldn't work because I'd have to recall the get miles, get gallons methods. Does that make sense? Do you guys have another kind of calculation you want to do? So I'll just make a new file, whatever we want to do.
Lifespan?
Lifespan? What would be, what kind of calculation is that?
Could we try the tip percentage? Because isn't that just like division or percentage?
Yeah, although that's the assignment. So a tip percentage, if you're just doing a percentage, right? It's just the
Just
amount times. So what you want, if it's a 15%, you want 0.15 times 0.15.
Just a simple
Yeah. If it's a 20, you want 0.2 times 20. The amount times 0.2.
Kind of the same thing. Here,
right. Yeah.
Percent instead of division.
Well, the percent is division. No, it'd be times. You'll be right. Times. So if you want to calculate a tip, so you have your total amount divided by tip percent. And the 10%, the easiest way to do this is as a decimal. Like 5% if you're being really cruel, 10 if you're a bit cheap, 15, 20. So, I mean, you just multiply it by a decimal. So you need to float when you take it in, right? You can't input it as an int unless you divide it by 100. All right, so let's do, you guys don't have another calculation you want to do? It's something not too long and complicated. I'm not sure how to calculate lifespan. Did I lose my new file? I think I did. I mean, there's always the temperature and stuff like that. I'm not sure if I remember the date time functions to do calculate your age based on your birthday. But I'm not sure I remember the date time functions for that. Don't want to do tip. We could do kilometers. Nobody has an exciting idea or something to do? Doesn't have to be a calculation, I suppose, either. What? Yeah, but then how would you calculate that? I mean, if you're thinking what parts are. Go ahead, yeah. So nobody has a good idea for something to calculate. Let's do
How much by meter?
Yeah, meters and feet sounds good. Do we want to do feet to meters or vice versa? Okay.
That's true.
All right, so we'll do meters to feet. This will actually be pretty simple because there won't be a lot of stuff to go in there. We really just need the number of feet, right? So the first thing, so just as a list of things we need to do, get the feet, calculate, do output, right? So the output, there's really only like the three pieces there. So the first one is simple, just def, so I'm going to say get feet, and we'll do feet equals, do we want to do it in whole numbers or do we want to allow decimals? This could get really complicated if we want to be able to enter it in feet and inches. Because inches to, then you'd have to figure out an inch to a centimeter as well. So the question is it an int or is it a float? If you do a float, let's do a float, but then you'd have to think of your feet in not as 5 feet 6 inches, but 5 feet point what part of 10, which is really hard. We used to actually do that many years ago. I worked as a surveyor for the Forest Service, and we used to do it in tenths of a foot, which is weird. Why not just do it in meters? I don't know. But we'll do a float. Input, enter the feet. It sounds weird, but okay. And then I'm just going to do a return, although actually because we're only getting one value, we could pass it if we wanted to. The other thing about methods, although it's not necessarily obvious, is they should be as independent of each other as possible. Right, so you can use them over and over again. All right, so then we need to do the calculation. And does anybody have the formula? I may use it though. So first of all, if I was doing this, I'm going to do 3.2. That sounds right. Feet equals get feet. And then meters would equal feet times 3.2. No, divided by, yeah, feet. So it's meters, we're returning meters. Divided by 3.2, right? Or is it times?
It'd be 1 times 0.30. Yeah.
It's feet. So 3 feet equals about 1 meter. I knew that. So it's. Anybody, so would that be though feet times, or probably be divided by 3.2, right? I don't know. My brain is totally fuzzed out here on math. Is it times or division? Times?
Yeah, the 0.3 times the feet. It's meters are longer than feet.
Right, they're longer than feet. That though doesn't make sense to me. So what?
0.3.
What would it be?
Like if you had like 12 feet and you divided it by 3.2, you get to like 3 or 4 meters.
Right.
So it would be divided.
Yeah, it's got to be divided. Because if you multiply it, you're making your feet
Oh, yeah.
big. Because you're basically 1 foot is 1/3 of a meter. Not exactly, but close. All right. So the question is, if we want to show both the feet and the meters, then what we would want to do is let's do. Actually, sometimes I call it display. Let's call it display this time, and we'll pass it feet and meters. Okay. So that doesn't exist yet, but I will do def display, and we'll do feet and feet, comma meters. Right. And then we can just do a print. And I'm going to do feet, and then we'll just say equals, and we'll do meters, and we'll do a comma, and we'll say meters. That makes sense? We're doing essentially the same thing. We get our feet, we do our calculation. This one might have been a better one to start with because it's simpler. So we get the feet from our input function. Meters is going to be the result of the calculation. If we're wrong, at least we know where it's going wrong. So if we do a display, we pass it down to here so that we can print those two values out. And then in main, again, we just want our def main first. So you define main before you can call it. We just want to call calc meters because it calls get feet and it calls the display. So we just want to do calc meters, and then we want to call main. So there's a sort of a logic here, and once you get the feel for the pattern, and the pattern can be much more complex than this. There are programs that have literally hundreds or thousands of functions. So the pattern gets way more complicated, right? But this is, basically this is sort of the root of that pattern. So I'm going to clear down here. Oops, I wrote clear in the wrong place. Wanted it down here. Okay, so let's try running that and see if it works. And then I think I will post these and we'll call it good. So enter the feet. So 100 feet should be like 30 meters, right? Should be 30.2 meters. Equals 31.25 meters, which is interesting, but yeah, all right. It is a quarter. 31.25, that's odd. Anyway, not quite 32. Is that calculation correct? It's close enough for me, but I wonder. The world would be a lot easier if we just moved to meters and kilometers.
In Celsius.
Yeah, and Celsius. They just make more sense.
Yeah, we did.
They're all based on 10. It just makes sense. Fahrenheit. I've never understood Fahrenheit's measures. Why is freezing 32 degrees and boiling 210 or 12? As opposed to 0 for freezing and 100 for boiling, which makes perfect sense. I know some people that live in Europe, and when they see American temperatures, they think they must be boiling in hell. 90 degrees, 95 in a Celsius scale, you're cooking to the point. Yeah. So how did this work? This one's a little simpler than the one before it. Yeah.
So in the display parameter, you have to do feet as opposed to just actually calling depth or depth.
So if you call get feet, it'll ask you to input the feet again.
Inside of the parameter.
Yeah. So if I if I called get feet in here, which you could do, I didn't show you that, but you can call a function as a parameter. Parameterized functions are called, but it would actually run the function. It would force you to enter the number of feet again, so that number would be different than the number here. I mean, you could. It's better. Generally, you only want to call the function where you need it. If you call it in here, let's do that. Don't do this for the final, but I'm going to do, oops, get feet. How do I do this, actually? Because I'd have to pass it as get feet, I think.
Would it work because you already said feet equals get feet?
Well, so that's how we're passing feet now. Feet equals get feet. I was just going to say, if you call it again, it's going to call the input thing again. And you should be able to pass it in the function, but I can't. What I'm trying to remember, we would have to pass get feet here down to here. Like, it couldn't be just feet that we pass. And I'd have to change a lot of things to do that, I think. So I might do that for next time just to show you, but I think I want to practice it before I make a fool of myself. Yours isn't working, or?
I know, like, I just passed it, I can pass
So
it.
it's invalid syntax.
Well, you mentioned it to me, but I was trying to double check.
I'll put a colon in. No, after the display.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah, that's a definition, so it needs a colon.
Oh, that's right, exactly.
But on your other point, yes, you can pass functions. I would not necessarily do that right away, though. So let's go. That's the floating boundary. So let's go back to start with. What's the software?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's finding about the math operator while it's in this deep. Oh, it's because you're not returning anything. You have to say return feed. don't need to do here. You return it, you have to return something.
Oh, you can't just hit return.
Yeah,
The actual.
You always have to return an actual thing. So it's always, it's not, you can't just do return, you have to do return feet, return
Did we do
something.
that on the basic?
Yes, we did, yeah. All right, I think, although it's a bit early, I don't have a whole lot more to cover, although we could play with this some more. What I would say is, so next time I'm going to give you pretty much open lab to work on the next assignment. I know a couple of you are done, but most of you are not. So the next one is using functions, and it's a little hard. So I will help. How many are done? I think 1, 2, maybe. So I think most are not. That's fine. And if you're back on a couple of assignments, you're still working on those, that's all right too. I'll help you with any of them. If you are totally done, you're welcome to come or not come on Thursday. It's up to you. If you're here, you can play with stuff, ask me other stuff. If you're not here, that's okay if you're done. That's true of most open lab days. If you don't want to show, that's okay. But if you're working on things, the advantage of showing up is that I'm here to help you with it. All right, so I'm going to post all this into the blog. I'm going to stop the video. This last part of the video has a lot of